No one said the word unwanted, but it clung to the boy like smoke from the train engine. He stood on the platform, a ghost waiting for a grave. 9 years old, with a coat too short at the wrists and a satchel that bumped his knee with every gust of wind. In his hand, he pinched a torn train ticket. It was his only proof that he was real. The conductor, a man with a face like sour milk, read names from a ledger. Each name was a key turning in a lock, a door opening to a new life. A couple with nervous smiles took a little girl's hand. A rancher with eyes that measured worth like lumber hefted a boy's bag onto his shoulder. One by one, the children were claimed. The conductor's voice was a shovel-scraping rock, and with every name he called, a door closed softly, leaving one less child on the platform, until there was only one left. The conductor stopped on a page where no ink would be added. He looked up, his patience worn thin as a thread. "Nathan," he called out, the name in accusation. "Nathan Cole." The boy Nathan just nodded. He'd learned long ago that smiling didn't change a thing. A woman in a stiff bonnet sniffed, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Too slight for farm work." Another man muttered, "Heard he's got a cough." Nathan hadn't coughed all day, but judgment doesn't need proof. It just needs a crowd. From the edge of that crowd, a man named Jacob Hale watched. His shoulders were broad, his hands calloused from work and loss. He was a man who had buried love once and wasn't keen on planting anything new. He'd promised himself he wouldn't. He'd promised his daughter, Eliza, they were just here to look. A lie he told to protect them both. But Eliza, all of 7 years old with braids as wild as her spirit, wasn't looking. She was staring. Her eyes, bright and fierce, were locked on the boy. She saw something the others didn't. Or maybe she just remembered something they'd all chosen to forget. The conductor slammed his ledger shut. The sound was final, like a coffin lid closing. He pointed at the ticket in Nathan's hand. "No claimants," he announced to the remaining townsfolk. "He goes back east. Evening train." The words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. He squeezed the ticket, his knuckles white. His eyes, which had held a flicker of hope, went dark. Someone in the crowd chuckled, a low, polite sound that was crueler than any shout. And that's when it happened. Eliza shot forward like an arrow from a bow. Before Jacob could even draw a breath to stop her, she was there. Her small hand, impossibly strong, clamped onto Nathan's wrist. The boy flinched, startled by the touch, as if a ghost had just grabbed him. "Don't go," Eliza said, her voice shaking, but clear as a bell. "You can't go back on that train." She turned then and looked straight at her father. Her eyes weren't just pleading, they were demanding. It was the same look she'd given him on another platform, on the day a different train had taken her mother away forever. Nathan stared at her, his lips parted in shock. "Miss," he whispered, the word careful, afraid. "They don't keep the ones nobody wants." Eliza's chin shot up. She was too young to understand ledgers, too young to care about rules made by sad-faced men. She turned to the crowd, to the conductor, to her father. Then she leaned in close to Nathan's ear, so close he could smell the sunshine in her hair. And she whispered 5 words. 5 words that changed everything. "You're my brother," she said. The whisper wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. It echoed across the platform louder than any train whistle. It was a truth that no ledger could hold. The conductor's face tightened. The town held its breath, ready to scoff. Nathan's fingers went slack, the torn ticket suddenly feeling like a foreign object in his hand. Eliza, still holding on tight, turned her tear-filled eyes to her father. She didn't whisper this time. She declared it. "Papa." And from far down the tracks, the evening train's whistle blew, a long, mournful cry. It was a question aimed right at Jacob's heart, and time to answer had just run out. The conductor's bark still echoed in the prairie air when Eliza did something no one expected. She snatched the torn ticket right out of Nathan's hand. The paper fluttered for a second, a wounded bird, before she crushed it to her chest. "He's not going," she declared. Her voice was high, but it didn't tremble. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision the world would just have to accept. A wave of gasps went through the remaining crowd. This was better than gossip. This was a spectacle. Nathan stared at her, his eyes wide. It wasn't just surprise on his face, it was fear, as if he'd never had anyone fight for him before, and he was terrified of what it might cost. The conductor marched forward, his face a thundercloud. "Little miss, that's enough," he grumbled. "You have no say here." Jacob felt the eyes of the town land on him like stones. He could already hear the whispers. Jacob Hale, too soft to control his own daughter, letting a child invite a beggar into his home. The shame tasted like rust in his mouth. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and sharp with warning. But she didn't back down. She didn't even look at the conductor. She looked straight up at her father, her eyes blazing through her tears. "You told me the truth is what matters most, Papa, more than what people whisper. And the truth is, he's my brother. It doesn't matter if you write it in your book or not." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. They were his wife's words, thrown back at him by her own daughter, the same stubborn grace that had seen them through droughts and hard winters. Nathan's shoulders started to shake. A single tear cut a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "No one's ever," he choked out, the words cracking. "No one's ever said that before." The conductor reached for the ticket, his patience gone. "Give me the ticket, child." But Jacob's hand shot out first, faster than a snake striking. His large, calloused hand closed over Eliza's, protecting the small fist that held the crumpled paper. The platform went dead silent. You could hear the steam hissing from the engine, hear the frantic beating of Jacob's own heart. Every eye was on his hand. Would he pry her fingers open, or would he let her stand? He held his daughter's gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the conductor. His voice was gravel, torn from deep in his chest. "One more day," he said. "He stays one more day. I'll decide by then." The crowd erupted in murmurs, disbelief, scorn. But in a few faces, Jacob saw something else, a flicker of respect. The conductor opened his mouth to argue, but Jacob's stare stopped him cold. It was the look of a man who had been pushed to his limit and wouldn't be pushed any further. "One day," the conductor finally grunted, snapping his ledger shut. He turned and strode away, the book tucked under his arm like a weapon he fully intended to use later. Eliza let out a shaky breath. She carefully unfolded the ticket and pressed it back into Nathan's hand, curling his trembling fingers around it. Her smile wobbled, but it held. "See?" she whispered. "You don't belong to the train anymore. You belong with us." Nathan stared at the ticket. A moment ago, it had been a mark of his exile. Now it felt like a promise. His eyes shone with a light that made Jacob's throat tighten. The townsfolk began to drift away, their tongues already wagging, the story spreading into the streets like a contagion. Jacob lifted Eliza into his arms. He nodded for Nathan to follow. The boy trailed behind them, clutching the ticket like it was a piece of the sun. As they left the platform, stepping from the shadow of the station into the dying light, Jacob felt the weight of his choice settle on him. He didn't know which was heavier, the judgment of the entire town, or the fragile hope of the boy walking behind him. He had told himself he was only buying one day, but deep down, in a place he didn't want to look, he knew the decision had already been made. Not by him, but by a little girl with more courage than any man on that platform. And as they walked toward the ranch, a storm was gathering. Not in the sky, but in the hearts of his neighbors. A storm of whispers and rumors that was about to break right over his head. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had bled across the plains, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The single lantern on the porch cast a weak, trembling light. Nathan followed Jacob and Eliza like a shadow, the torn ticket still a permanent part of his fist. His satchel, holding all his worldly possessions, was pitifully light. Inside was nothing but a threadbare shirt and a small, flat tin button he guarded like a diamond. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and leftover stew. To Nathan, it smelled like heaven. He stopped dead on the threshold, his toes curling on the cool floorboards. He looked like a stray dog, afraid the door he'd just been let through was about to be slammed in his face. Eliza wouldn't have it. She grabbed his arm and pulled him inside with the unshakable confidence of a queen. "Sit here," she commanded, pointing to the wooden bench by the table. When he hesitated, she gave him a little shove. He sat. Jacob didn't say a word. He just hung his hat on its peg and lit another lamp. His face was a mask of stone, giving nothing away. He ladled stew into 3 bowls. He slid one across the table to Nathan. The boy stared at it, his hands in his lap, as if he didn't dare touch it, as if he expected it to be snatched away. "Eat," Jacob said. His voice was rough, but it wasn't mean. Nathan picked up the spoon. His hand shook so badly he could barely manage the first bite. When the warm stew hit his tongue, his eyes squeezed shut. He looked like a man praying. Eliza leaned in close, her rag doll, Sparrow, tucked under her arm. "He was hungry, Papa," she whispered, as if it were a secret. "I knew he was." Jacob just grunted, his jaw tight. He'd seen hunger, but seeing it on a child at his own table was different. It felt like a failure, even though he'd only just met the boy. Nathan ate with a slow, deliberate caution. Each bite was a test. Each swallow was a victory. When the bowl was empty, he set the spoon down so quietly it didn't make a sound. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible. The silence in the room was thick. The only sound was the hiss of the lamp. Then Eliza broke it. She slammed her doll, Sparrow, onto the table with a loud thud. It was a declaration of war. "He's my brother now," she stated, looking right at her father. "And brothers eat at the same table." Jacob froze, his own spoon halfway to his mouth. He wanted to tell her to be quiet. He wanted to explain that words, even true ones, couldn't change the world. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw his wife looking back at him. That same fire, that same refusal to bend. He swallowed the stew, but it tasted like ash. Nathan ducked his head, trying to hide the tears now streaming down his face. He wasn't crying from sadness. It was something else, something heavier. His hand tightened around the ticket in his pocket. The sharp edges of the paper dug into his palm. The pain was real. It was proof this wasn't a dream. Suddenly, Jacob pushed his chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the floor. He strode to the open doorway and stared out into the blackness of the prairie. He was looking for an answer the night couldn't give him. "It's just one night," he told himself. "In the morning, I can still send him back." But Eliza's words echoed in his head, over and over. "Brothers eat at the same table." He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. His heart hammered against his ribs. Behind him, he heard a small rustle. He glanced back. Nathan had taken the torn ticket out of his pocket. He carefully, almost reverently, tucked it underneath the edge of his empty bowl. It was a tiny gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was as if he was claiming his place, saying the ticket didn't belong to the railroad anymore. It belonged here, at this table. Jacob stood there, trapped in the doorway between the darkness outside and the fragile light inside. He felt a terrifying thought take root in his mind. Maybe the choice was never his to make at all. Maybe it had been made the second his daughter whispered 5 simple words, and he was just the last one to realize it. Morning came with the distant, mournful whistle of the eastbound train. It was a ghost haunting the prairie, a reminder of the threat that was coming. Nathan was already awake. He sat on the bench by the door, the torn ticket spread flat on his knee. He smoothed its creases with his fingertips, over and over, as if by making the paper perfect, he could make his own place in this house permanent. Eliza was a tiny sentinel beside him, her doll Sparrow clutched in one arm, her other hand gripping Nathan's sleeve like a vice. "You're not going," she kept whispering. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was an incantation. Jacob moved around the kitchen like a man in a trance. He poured coffee he didn't taste. His eyes kept darting toward the boy, then quickly away. He was afraid that if he looked too long, the connection would become too real to break. Then came the knock. 3 hard official raps on the door that made the whole cabin shudder. Jacob's gut clenched. He knew who it was. He opened the door, and there stood the conductor, his face set like concrete, the ledger held under his arm like a Bible of damnation. "Morning, Hale," the conductor said, his voice flat. "Eastbound leaves in an hour. I've come for the boy." Jacob's body went rigid. He could feel Eliza's stare burning a hole in his back. "I told you one day," he managed to say, his voice tight. The conductor's thin lips pressed together. "The day's over. He's on the manifest. He rides." On the bench, Nathan seemed to shrink. He snatched the ticket and crumpled it into a ball, the paper crackling in the tense silence. Eliza sprang to her feet. She planted herself directly between the conductor and Nathan, a tiny warrior with wild braids. "He is not leaving," she shouted. "He's my brother." From the fence line, a couple of neighbors who had been loitering, hoping for a show, let out audible gasps. The conductor's eyes narrowed. "Child," he said, and for the first time he sounded more tired than cruel. "Feelings don't change the facts. Law and blood are what matter. This boy has neither here. The railroad claims him." Eliza's face went bright red. Tears of fury streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't budge. She reached back, yanked the crumpled ticket from Nathan's terrified grasp, and held it high in the air. "Then here's the law," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "This says he belongs here, with us, and I'm not giving it back." The words hung in the air, electric. Even the nosy neighbors fell silent, stunned by the sheer force of the little girl's will. A child defying the railroad with nothing but a worthless piece of paper. Jacob felt something inside him break. The carefully built walls around his heart crumbled. He saw his wife's face, heard Eliza's first cries after she was gone. He had sworn he would never risk that kind of pain again. But watching his daughter, trembling but unbroken, fighting for this lost boy, he couldn't stand by. The conductor's gaze shifted to him. "Well, Hale, are you going to let a child do your talking? Or are you a man who speaks for his own house?" The question wasn't just for the conductor. It was for the neighbors, for the whole town. It was for Jacob himself. He looked at Nathan, at the silent plea in the boy's eyes. He looked at Eliza, clutching the ticket like a flag in a battle. He wanted to say no. He wanted to end it. It was the safe thing to do. But the word died in his throat. It was strangled by the fierce, beautiful love he saw in his daughter's face. "He stays," Jacob said. His voice was a low growl. He said it again, louder this time, for the neighbors, for the world. "He stays!" Whispers erupted from the fence line. The conductor took a step back, his face a mixture of shock and disgust. He snapped his ledger shut with a crack. "You'll answer for this, Hale," he hissed. "The town won't stand for it." He turned on his heel and stomped away. Eliza let out a sob of relief. She gently uncurled Nathan's fingers and placed the ticket back in his palm. "See?" she whispered fiercely. "You're still ours." Nathan stared at the ticket, then up at Jacob, his eyes shining with a disbelief so pure it was heartbreaking. Jacob stood frozen in the doorway. He knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The fight was no longer about a boy and a train. It was about him against everyone else. And as the conductor's footsteps faded, Jacob Hale knew he had just declared war on his own town. The story of Jacob's defiance spread through town faster than a prairie fire in a dry season. By midday, it was the only thing anyone was talking about. In the mercantile, women huddled together, their whispers sharp as needles. "Did you hear? Jacob Hale's girl claimed that orphan boy. Right in front of the conductor. Called him brother. The nerve. Jacob's lost his mind since Martha passed." At the blacksmith's forge, the hammer fell silent. A rancher named Coulter, a big man with a face like cured leather, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Mark my words," he boomed. "A man who lets a child run his house has no business raising cattle. He'll bring shame on us all." So when Jacob guided his wagon down the main street later that afternoon, he was met with a wall of silence and hard stares. He needed flour and salt, simple things, but the trip felt like walking a gauntlet. Nathan sat beside him, small and tense, his hand never leaving the pocket where he kept the ticket. Eliza sat on his other side, her doll sparrow clutched tight, her chin held high as if she dared anyone to say a word. The boardwalks, usually filled with friendly chatter, went quiet as they passed. People stopped and stared. A woman pulled her own child closer, as if Nathan carried a disease. Another pair of ladies near the mercantile door didn't even bother to lower their voices. Tying her fate to a beggar. She'll be ruined before she's 10. Eliza stiffened. Her little hand shot out and grabbed Nathan's. "Papa," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "They're wrong. He's not a beggar. He's my brother." The words sliced through the thick air. A horse tied to a nearby post actually startled. Jacob felt a hot flush of anger and shame creep up his neck. He wanted to tell her to be quiet, to not make it worse, but he couldn't. Her courage shamed his own fear. He squared his shoulders, lifted her and Nathan from the wagon, and pushed through the doors of the mercantile like he owned the place. The shopkeeper, a man Jacob had known for 20 years, paused what he was doing. His eyes flicked from Nathan's patched coat to Eliza's defiant face, and finally to Jacob's stormy expression. "Afternoon, Jacob," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Got another mouth to feed, I see." The implication was clear. "Can you afford it?" "Put it on my account," Jacob said, his voice low and dangerous. The shopkeeper hesitated for a split second, then nodded and began weighing out the flour. Nathan stood by the door, his head down, trying to make himself invisible. But then Eliza did something small and kind. She tucked her doll, Sparrow, into his arms. Nathan looked down at the doll's lopsided, yarn-stitched smile, and a tiny, fragile smile touched his own lips. When they stepped back outside, the situation had escalated. Sheriff Langley was walking toward them, his stride slow and deliberate. He wasn't a man who hurried, which made his presence all the more intimidating. Jacob felt the trap closing. He put a hand on each child's shoulder, trying to steer them back to the wagon, trying to shield them with his own body. But the whispers followed them, louder now. Then Coulter's voice boomed from across the street. "If Hale wants to take in strays, that's his business. But when he lets his girl call one family, he makes it our business. He shames this town." Jacob stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with Coulter's. The whole street held its breath. "You will not speak of my daughter," Jacob growled, his voice a thunderclap that rolled down the street. "You will not shame her for having a heart. Not today, not ever." A dead silence fell over the town. You could hear the sizzle of hot metal from the smithy, the nervous shuffle of feet on the boardwalk. Eliza pressed herself against Nathan, shielding him with her tiny frame. "It's okay," she whispered. "Papa will fix it." Nathan clutched the doll tighter. The torn ticket in his pocket felt like a lead weight. Jacob lifted the children into the wagon and took the reins. As he drove away, he saw faces in every window, watching him. Some were filled with scorn, but a few, he noticed, held a different expression: doubt, unease, as if Eliza's simple act of kindness had planted a seed of uncertainty in their hardened hearts. The horse's hooves struck sparks on the dusty street. Jacob knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that this was no longer about whispers. The first shot had just been fired in a war he didn't know how to win, and the battleground wasn't just the town, it was his own home, his own future, and the fate of the two children sitting beside him. That night, the prairie was unnervingly quiet. Inside the small cabin, the silence was even louder. Nathan ate his stew slowly, methodically, as if he was counting every bean. He had placed the torn ticket on the table beside his bowl, smoothed out and folded perfectly. It sat there like a silent guest at the meal. Eliza, exhausted from the day's battles, leaned her head against his shoulder, nearly asleep. Her doll, Sparrow, was propped up between their bowls, a silent, lopsided guardian. Jacob ate without tasting his food. His mind was a whirlwind. Coulter's words, the sheriff's slow walk, the hard eyes of his neighbors. He was so lost in thought that the knock on the door made him jump. It was a firm, official knock, not friendly. He opened the door and his heart sank. Sheriff Langley stood on his porch, silhouetted against the rising moon. His face was grim, his hat held respectfully in his hands, but his eyes meant business. "Evening, Jacob," the sheriff said, his voice low. "The town is buzzing. I've had a dozen men in my office today, all telling me the same story, about you and this boy." Jacob stood his ground, one hand braced on the doorframe. "He's just a boy, Sam. He earns his keep." The sheriff's gaze slid past Jacob, into the warm light of the kitchen. He saw Nathan freeze, spoon in midair. He saw Eliza glare at him with the ferocity of a mother bear. "Your daughter calls him brother," Langley said, his voice flat. "That makes it more than just keep. People are scared, Jacob. They see you breaking the rules. And rules, good or bad, are all that hold a place like this together." Jacob's voice hardened. "What's the rule, Sam? That we let a child be thrown away because his name isn't in a book? If those are the rules, Maybe they need breaking. The sheriff took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You know this town better than anyone. It has a long memory. Remember the fever that came through with that drifter 5 years back? Took Coulter's youngest. People don't forget that. They see a stray. They see a threat. Fair or not, that's the truth of it. You need to do this the right way. Adopt him proper or send him back. This in between, this. Whisper of a brother. It's going to tear this town apart, and it's going to ruin you. Nathan had shrunk so far into his seat he was barely visible. His hand crept toward the folded ticket, his only proof of who he was or wasn't. Eliza, however, pushed her stool back and marched right to the doorway. She stood beside her father, clutching Sparrow like a weapon. He's ours, she announced, her chin trembling but her voice steady. You can't make me take it back. Sparrow heard me say it. It's official. For the first time, a flicker of something other than duty crossed the sheriff's face. It might have been amusement, or maybe just surprise. He sighed, a long, weary sound. Child, words have weight. You can't just unsay them. Jacob placed a heavy hand on his daughter's shoulder. He looked the sheriff dead in the eye. She's right, he said, his voice like iron. The word has been spoken. You asked for my decision, Sam. Here it is. For tonight, he is at my table. He is under my roof. That makes him mine. Langley studied him for a long, silent moment. Tonight might be all you get, Jacob, he said softly. The town council is calling a meeting. They'll demand an answer, a final one. Don't let a child's promise cost you everything you have left. He placed his hat back on his head, gave a slow nod, and disappeared into the darkness. Jacob closed the door. He leaned against it, the wood cool against his back, and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The cabin felt small, besieged. Eliza took Nathan's hand, their fingers intertwined. Nathan looked up at Jacob, a question in his eyes he didn't dare ask. Jacob's gaze fell on the neatly folded ticket on the table. The sheriff was right. Eliza's words couldn't be unsaid. Her whisper had become a shout. Her claim had become a law unto itself, challenging every other law the town lived by. Outside, the prairie wind began to howl. It sounded like a jury, arguing over a verdict. And inside, Jacob Hale knew that the time for choosing was over. The trial was about to begin. The next morning, the town's verdict arrived in the form of a rider. A formal meeting had been called at the town hall. Jacob's name wasn't on the summons, but the message was clear. It was a trial, and he was the one accused. He hitched the wagon in the gray light of dawn, his movements stiff and deliberate. Eliza and Nathan stood on the porch watching him, two small figures huddled together against the coming storm. Nathan clutched the torn ticket, now softened and frayed from constant handling. Eliza took her doll, Sparrow, and pressed it into his other hand. She'll keep you safe, she whispered, and she'll listen for Papa's voice. Jacob's heart ached at the sight. He wanted to tell them it would be all right, but he couldn't lie to them. Not now. I'll be back soon, was all he could manage, and the words felt like dust in his mouth. The town hall was packed. It smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and anger. Faces turned as he walked in, 100 pairs of eyes fixing on him, cold and hard. Sheriff Langley stood at the front, looking weary. The rancher, Coulter, didn't wait for any formalities. He pushed his way forward, his face flushed with rage. We all heard the story, Hale, he boomed, his voice filling the room. Is it true? Your girl stood on that platform and claimed that stray as her own kin? Jacob met his glare without flinching. She spoke the truth of her heart. A wave of cruel laughter swept through the hall. A woman in a dark bonnet stood up. The heart of a child is not law, she shrilled. He's a vagrant, a mouth to feed. If we allow this, what's next? Every orphan from here to the Mississippi will be at our door, claiming to be our brother, stealing the bread from our own children's mouths. Sheriff Langley raised a hand, calling for quiet. His eyes were on Jacob. You know the fear in this town, Jacob. I warned you. They need this settled. If you intend to keep the boy, you must go through the circuit judge. File the papers. Make it legal. If not, he goes back on the next train. This middle ground, it's tearing at the seams of this community. Jacob's hands balled into fists at his sides. Community, he growled, the word a bitter taste. Is it community to stand by and watch a child be thrown away like trash? Is it order to mock a boy so thoroughly that no one dares show him a moment of kindness? If that's your order, then I'll take the shame. I'll stand against it. The room erupted, shouts of shame and traitor mixed with a few stunned gasps. Coulter stepped right up to Jacob, his face inches away. He spat on the floorboards. Those are big words, Hale, but words won't protect you when your barn mysteriously burns down, or when your credit at the mercantile runs dry. We won't let one man's pride destroy the order we've built here. The threat was unmistakable. Langley slammed his hand on the table. Enough! This will not be settled by threats. He turned to Jacob, his voice heavy, final. The town demands a decision. You have until the Saturday train. Either you bring the boy to the platform and send him back east, or you face the consequences. There is no other choice. Jacob looked around the room. He saw the hatred in Coulter's eyes. He saw the fear in the faces of his neighbors. But he also saw something else. In the eyes of a few, a flicker of doubt, a hint of shame. Eliza's defiance had done more than cause trouble. It had forced them all to look in the mirror. He turned and walked out of the hall without another word. Their shouts and insults followed him like a pack of dogs. Outside, the morning sun felt too bright, too cheerful for the darkness in his soul. The wagon was where he left it, but he wasn't alone. Eliza and Nathan were sitting on the bench waiting for him. They had walked all the way from the ranch. Did they listen, Papa? Eliza asked, her small face tense with worry. Jacob looked at his daughter and at the silent, terrified boy beside her. He took the reins, his hands unsteady. They listened, he said, his voice grim. He knew what their answer was. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted a public surrender. They wanted to see him broken on the train platform for all the county to see. The horse lurched forward, and with every turn of the wagon wheel, Jacob could feel Saturday rushing toward them, a final, unavoidable judgment day. The week crawled by, each day heavier than the last. The town treated them like ghosts. No one would meet Jacob's eye. Children were hurried away when Eliza and Nathan drew near. The mercantile owner politely informed Jacob that his credit was, for the time being, suspended. The war was quiet, but it was total. By Saturday, the air itself felt thick with anticipation. Jacob knew he couldn't hide. The town wanted its pound of flesh, and they wanted it in public. He found himself walking toward the train station, the same path he had taken a week ago, but this time it felt like a walk to the gallows. Eliza held his left hand. Nathan, clutching her right hand, walked on her other side. The boy was pale, his eyes wide and dark. He kept touching the ticket in his pocket, the small gesture a prayer of its own. The platform was swarmed. It seemed the entire county had turned out for the show. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces a sea of grim, hungry expressions. The train was already there, hissing steam, impatient. Sheriff Langley stood near the conductor, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Coulter was front and center, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Here he is," Coulter bellowed, pointing a thick finger at Nathan. "The boy who belongs to no one. The ledger says he goes east, and by God he will go east. Stand aside, Hale. Let the law be done." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. The conductor, seeing his chance, flipped open his ledger with a dramatic flourish. "Nathan Cole!" he called out, his voice ringing with authority. "Unclaimed passenger. The train departs." Nathan flinched as if struck. He stared at the wooden planks of the platform, unable to look up. But Eliza moved before Jacob could. She let go of her father's hand and stepped in front of Nathan, shielding him. "He is claimed," she cried, her voice breaking but carrying over the hiss of the train. She held up her doll, Sparrow, in one hand and gripped Nathan's sleeve with the other. "He is my brother, and you will not take him." The words, so pure and so fierce, sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Some people shifted their feet. Others looked away, suddenly ashamed. Coulter just laughed. "A child's fantasy isn't the law. Get her out of the way." He started to move forward, his intention clear. But then Nathan did something unexpected. With trembling hands, he pulled the tattered ticket from his pocket. He held it out, not to the conductor, but to Eliza. "It's not mine," he whispered, his voice hoarse but audible in the sudden hush. "It's yours. You keep it." He pressed the ticket into her hand. "You were the only one who ever wanted it." The simple, heartbreaking truth of his words silenced the entire platform. Even the train seemed to hold its breath. Jacob felt the moment like a brand on his soul. The choice he had been wrestling with all week was no longer a choice. It was a duty. He stepped forward, placing himself between Coulter and the children. He looked out at the silent, watching faces of his neighbors, the men and women he had known his whole life. And he spoke, his voice booming, filled with the pain of a man who had already lost too much and would not lose another soul. "To hell with the ledger," he thundered. "My daughter spoke the truth. This boy found mercy in her heart, and I will not let any of you shame him for it. He eats at my table. He sleeps under my roof, and by the God that made us all, that makes him mine." The platform exploded. Shouts of outrage, gasps of disbelief, but also, scattered through the angry noise, a few cries of "Aye, and let him be." Langley held up his hands, his face a mask of authority. He let the noise die down, his eyes locked on Jacob. Then he swept his gaze over the crowd. "You heard the man," the sheriff said, his voice firm. "A house has claimed the boy. That is the oldest law there is. He does not have to board that train." Coulter swore, his face purple with rage. But no one was listening to him anymore. People began to turn away, their appetite for cruelty soured. The spectacle was over, and the ending was not the one they expected. Nathan's knees buckled in relief. His whole body sagged as the weight of a lifetime of rejection finally lifted. Eliza threw her arms around him, crushing Sparrow between them. "I told you," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I told you, you were ours." Jacob stood, his hands shaking, the roar of the crowd still ringing in his ears. The storm had broken over him, and he was still standing. The town would not forgive him quickly, but the verdict had been delivered, not by a man with a ledger, but by a father with a spine. The train whistle screamed one last time, a shriek of defeat, and as the engine began to chuff, pulling the empty car eastward, Jacob knew there was no going back. The boy belonged to them now, bound not by paper or by law, but by a love that had been declared and defended in front of the whole world. As the last car of the train disappeared over the horizon, it felt like the town itself was exhaling. The crowd melted away, people avoiding Jacob's eyes, their whispers now uncertain, tinged with a grudging respect. Jacob guided the two children through the stragglers, his shoulders back, his head held high. Nathan walked in a daze, his hand still holding Eliza's. In his other hand, he clutched the ticket she had pressed back into his palm. It didn't feel like a sentence anymore. It felt like a key. Back at the ranch, the quiet that greeted them was a peaceful one. The battle was over. Jacob took off his hat and hung it on the peg. He watched Nathan, who stood hesitating by the door, still afraid to fully enter, as if the welcome might expire at any moment. "You're home now, Nathan," Eliza said, tugging him inside. "Papa said so. It's forever." Home. The word was foreign on Nathan's tongue. He looked at Jacob, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He held out the frayed ticket. "This is all I had," he whispered. "It's not much." Jacob's rough hand gently took the slip of paper. He looked at the smudged ink, the torn corner. It was a symbol of everything the boy had survived. He walked to the small wooden mantel over the fireplace. On it sat the family Bible, its leather cover softened by the hands of his parents and his wife. He opened the heavy book to the page where his own marriage and Eliza's birth were recorded. He carefully slid the torn train ticket between the pages. Then he closed the Bible. The sound was soft, but final. "It has a place now," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you." Nathan's breath hitched. He understood. The ticket wasn't just being put away. It was being added to their history. It had become part of their family. Eliza clapped her hands. "Now he can't ever leave," she declared with perfect 7-year-old logic. Jacob looked at them, his daughter who had inherited her mother's fierce heart, and the boy who had a strength he was only just beginning to discover. He had been so afraid of letting another person into his life, so terrified of the pain of loss. But looking at them, their hands still linked, he felt a strength that was far greater than his fear. Nathan took a small, hesitant step forward. "Does this mean—" he started, his voice barely a whisper. "Does this mean I should call you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Jacob knelt, so he was eye level with the boy. He placed one hand on Nathan's shoulder, the other on Eliza's. "It means you are a son of this house," he said, his voice gentle. "You are my son, the same as she is my daughter. You call me whatever your heart tells you to." The boy's lip trembled. He swallowed hard. Then so quietly it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire, he whispered the word, "Papa." Eliza beamed, a smile of pure triumph. She took her doll, Sparrow, and pushed her into Nathan's arms, a final, official transfer of guardianship. Jacob closed his eyes for a moment. The familiar ache of grief in his chest was gone. In its place was something new, something expanding, something that felt like hope. He stood and pulled both children into a hug, his strong arms encircling them both. Outside, the prairie wind whistled softly. Inside, a family had been forged, not from blood, but from bravery. The ledger had been wrong. The town had been wrong. The truest things are not written in ink. They are written in the heart. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps us bring more stories like this to you. Now, for our question of the day, when everyone else turns their back, is it courage or foolishness to be the one person who steps forward? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.